This legislation, I believe, is the most radical legislation the Senate has considered in the 9 years I've been here, and it is the most dangerous legislation pending before the United States Congress. You know, I listened to the speeches this morning. I listened to Senator Schumer's speech, where he recounted this country's shameful history of Jim Crow laws. And he's right. Jim Crow laws were bigoted, racist, and disenfranchised millions of people. And it is worth remembering that those Jim Crow laws were drafted by Democrats, they were implemented by Democrats, and they kept Democrats in power. Now, today's talking point, repeated in the media, is that was the Democrats of yesterday, not today. Well, today the Democrats are doing it again. This legislation, to use a phrase that has been popularized on the media recently, is Jim Crow 2.0. This legislation would disenfranchise millions of Americans. Many of us are referring to this legislation as the Corrupt Politicians Act, because it would do. Senator Schumer talked about politicians picking their constituents. That's what this legislation does. This legislation is designed to ensure that Democrats never lose another election. This legislation would register millions of illegal aliens to vote. It is intended to do that. It is intended to do that because Democrats have made the decision that millions of illegal aliens voting are likely to vote for Democrats. This would register vast numbers of criminals and felons to vote because Democrats have made the decisions that criminals and felons are likely to vote for Democrats. This legislation strikes down virtually every voter integrity law adopted at the state level. Voter ID laws. Over 70% of Americans support voter ID laws. By the way, over 60% of African Americans in this country support voter ID laws. 29 states have voter ID laws on the books. What does this legislation do? Strikes them all down. Says it's illegal for any state to have a voter ID law. Ballot harvesting, 31 states prohibit ballot harvesting. Why? Because it is a corrupt practice where paid operatives handle the ballots of someone else, and it has repeatedly led to instances of stealing votes. What does this bill do? It strikes down all 31 states' restrictions on ballot harvesting. This bill turns the Federal Election Commission from a bipartisan agency into a partisan agency. Into a partisan agency controlled by Democrats. Why? Because Democrats want Chuck Schumer in charge of the Federal Election Commission. The effect of that, I will point out, will be that every Republican senator and every Republican House member will be investigated, will be fined, will be prosecuted by the Federal Election Commission. By the way, if this bill were to pass and miraculously Democrats were to lose power, and this is designed to make it impossible for Democrats to lose power, I ask you for a moment, which Democrat on this committee would want a federal election committee controlled by Senator McConnell? Because I guarantee you, every Democrat would then be investigated and prosecuted, and the Federal Election Commission shouldn't be a partisan weapon designed to win elections. This legislation is profoundly dangerous, and the reason it suppresses millions of votes is by allowing millions of people to vote illegally. And that is the intended effect, and that would be the actual effect of this bill. It dilutes the legal votes of American citizens. Senator Schumer said, and I wrote this down, the stench of oppression. When Democrats drafted Jim Crow the last time, well, the stench of oppression is here again. Senator Schumer said, the eyes of history are on you. Well, the eyes of history are on you as well. And let me point out something. It's just a few years ago that Republicans had control of the White House, the Senate, and the House. We didn't do this. We didn't try to change the election rules so that Democrats could never be elected. We didn't engage in the corruption to say, we're going to rig the game. So if the voters decide to throw the bums out, the voters don't get the right to do that because we're going to put our thumb on the scale so that only our party wins. To my knowledge, not a single Republican suggested doing that. This bill doesn't protect voting rights. it steals voting rights from the American people. In the course of this markup, I expect that we're going to consider a number of amendments. I've introduced 46 amendments focused on substantive elements of this bill. We're going to discuss each aspect of this bill and how they disenfranchise the American voters, but sadly, I expect to see a lot of play acting. All Democrats voting against those amendments, all Republicans voting for them, because this bill isn't designed to be bipartisan. This bill was drafted to get 0 Republican votes. It got 0 Republican votes in the House, and it was drafted to get 0 Republican votes in the Senate. Why? Because it's not about protecting anyone's rights. It's about ensuring one party's dominance at the expense of the voting rights of the American people. And by the way, the history of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, landmark victories for voting rights in this country, it was the Republican Party that led the fight to pass those amendments. We should be protecting everyone's right, and facilitating fraud and registering people to vote illegally undermines the integrity of democracy. And as Senator Schumer observed, the eyes of history are on all of us. You know, as the American people think of needy populations in need of assistance, I have yet to encounter a single constituent in Texas or in any of our states that considers politicians anywhere near the top of the list. This bill, in addition to being the Corrupt Politicians Act, is also the Welfare for Politicians Act, because this bill creates a matching program for politicians, not just an even matching program, a 6-to-1 matching program of federal funds flooding into federal elections, because the Democratic majority, by the way, the narrowest majority possible in a 50-50 Senate, has deemed that billions of dollars of federal funds need to flow into funding their campaigns. Well, how would this operate in effect? Well, I looked at the quarterly reports from each of the members of this committee and what it would mean in practice. The chairwoman, Senator Klobuchar, would have received $6.9 million in federal funds for last quarter. Senator Feinstein would have received $906. Senator Schumer would have received slightly over $1 million. Senator Warner would have received $143,000. Senator Leahy would have received $306,000. Senator King would have received $756. Senator Merkley would have received just over $1.1 million. Senator Padilla would have received $482,000. And Senator Ossoff would have received $11,400,000. Now, one can understand why Senator Ossoff would support something that would give his campaign $11,400,000. But I would note that I would receive under your bill $24 million. Last quarter, my campaign raised in total $5.3 million. That came from over 127,000 donations. 98% of those donations were under $100. The average donation was $41. I asked my Democratic colleagues, why on earth do you want to give my campaign $24 million? I don't want $24 million of federal funds to fund my campaign. And by the way, this bill would give my campaign up to $56 million. The 24 is just the max for the primary. Your constituents in every one of your states, I'd venture, do not want to give your campaigns or my campaigns millions of dollars of federal money. We don't need welfare for politicians, and I urge you to support Senator Blunt's amendment. The vast majority of Americans support voter ID law. I commend Senator Hyde-Smith for this amendment. 75% of Americans support requiring a photo ID for voting. And by the way, that's bipartisan. 60% of Democrats support requiring photo ID to vote. 77% of independents support requiring photo ID to vote. There are 29 states that have enacted that, including the state of Georgia. And this legislation strikes down all 29 of those laws and makes it illegal to require photo ID to vote. By the way, you need a photo ID to drive. You need a photo ID to get on an airplane. You need a photo ID to get married. You need a photo ID if you're young to go to an R-rated movie. You need a photo ID to buy a beer. And you need a photo ID to pick up your tickets at the will call window of a baseball game. And yet the position of Senate Democrats is those 75% of Americans are wrong and no photo ID should be required. And let me point out also that the vast majority of voters have IDs. A 2017 University of Houston study found that, quote, virtually all registered voters in Harris County and CD23 who did not participate in the November 2016 election possessed one of the state-approved forms of photo ID needed to cast a vote in person. I'm Hispanic. Somehow I managed to figure out how to get a driver's license. And in fact, I think it is a condescending approach of some Democrats to say minorities can't figure out how to get a photo ID. It is striking. The chairwoman said a minute ago that voter fraud is exceptionally rare. That is an ahistorical position. We have seen voter fraud as a persistent aspect of our elections. The state of Texas, going back to LBJ's election in Duval County and the magic box of ballots that showed up at the end, the 1960 presidential election, Cook County and JFK, voter fraud has been a persistent aspect of our history. And what is striking is it is not just Republicans saying this. It is the Carter-Baker Commission. The Carter-Baker Commission, as I said, was chaired by Democratic President Jimmy Carter. Here's what Democratic President Jimmy Carter, here's what the commission he chaired said, quote, "The electoral system cannot inspire public confidence if no safeguards exist to deter or to detect fraud or to confirm the identity of voters. Photo identification cards currently are needed to board a plane, enter federal buildings, and cash a check. Voting is equally important." Jimmy Carter was not being racist when he recommended adopting photo ID to vote. The 29 states, including the people of Georgia, were not being racist when they required photo ID to protect against voter fraud. It is almost as if Senate Democrats looked at the recommendation of Carter-Baker in terms of how to fight voter fraud and inverted them all, reversed them all, and said, how do we get more voter fraud? Let's do more of that. Let's do ballot harvesting. Let's get rid of photo ID. This is contrary to the views of the vast majority of the American people, and it's contrary to any effort to ensure the integrity of elections.
Would the senator from Texas yield for a question?
Certainly.
As a former Supreme Court clerk yourself, am I not correct that the Supreme Court has actually taken this issue up? The U.S. Supreme Court? And what did they say?
So Senator McConnell is correct. The state of Indiana was one of the first states to pass photo ID for voting. That was challenged by a number of plaintiff groups heavily affiliated with Democrats. They brought a challenge saying that it was discriminatory. They brought many of the same arguments Senator Merkley made a minute ago, suggesting that it discriminated against minorities. That case went up to the U.S. Supreme Court. At the time it did, I was the Solicitor General of the state of Texas, and so I led a coalition of states, Texas and a number of other states, defending Indiana's photo ID law. And the Supreme Court, by a vote of 6-3, upheld Indiana's photo ID law. The majority opinion was written by Justice John Paul Stevens, one of the most renowned liberals on the court. Justice Stevens, for a 6-justice majority, wrote an opinion explaining that voter fraud is a real problem, it's a persistent problem, and indeed describing how the data show that photo ID laws, rather than suppress the vote, actually increase turnout and increase the confidence that voters have that their votes will be counted. And I would note that often the victims of unscrupulous ballot harvesting, of theft of votes, are African American or Hispanic low-income voters, and the Supreme Court upheld it as protecting our right to vote, which means what this bill does right now, without Senator Hyde-Smith's amendment, undermines our right to vote because it encourages voter fraud, and no one in this body should be encouraging voter fraud.